All right, Sanjita Nainagate, our sole contention is feminism. Action 18 writes that the IMF has failed to acknowledge the advice it gives to countries reflects and reinforces patriarchal power structures, entrenching rather than transforming gender inequality. This happens in 5 ways. First is government attention. Detra and Peckson 15 find that IMF programs are less likely to reduce the ability and willingness of governments to protect women's economic rights. If governments are under scrutiny to comply with IMF regulations to continue receiving aid, they become unwilling to strongly intervene in society and the economy to protect women. Reductions of government spending that accompany the adoption of IMF structural programs undermine government's capacity to enforce women's economic rights. Thus, the predicted probability of women's major economic rights violation increases by 57% of the recipient countries of IMF loans. Second is policy focus. Gender bias and neoclassical economic theory renders the effects of SAPs on women invisible. Economists focus overwhelmingly on the productive economy. In other words, they focus on those aspects of the economy that make profits and cover costs. Economists thus ignore the reproductive economy, which meets the needs and sustains human life. This sector of the economy is where the majority of women work. By viewing the economy in this way, women's labor is invisible and therefore obscures the economic and social costs of structural adjustment on women's working lives. Thus, women do 70% of the world's work, but only receive 10% of the revenues and only 1% of the wealth. Such an oversight in acknowledging women's labor has a grave impact on women in society when structural adjustment programs are put into place. This is seen on how IMF programs are evaluated. In India, after SAPs were instituted, the economy had a 1.5% growth rate. However, there was a recession in the agricultural and industrial sectors where majority of women work. The impacts of those lives were unseen due to an overall rise in GNP. The third one is agriculture. SAP requirements include increasing exports. In developing countries, this usually means that agricultural exports must increase, consequently increasing cash crops. Campbellton finds that cash crops decrease the amount of food and income for women. In Ghana, for example, due to an increase in the number of cash crops and an increase in the amount of land used to grow cash crops, Ghanaian women are left with smaller holdings and poor soil without the ability to practice crop rotation. Food production declines and malnutrition deepens. Empirically, Campbell continues that if there's less food, men receive the same amount of food while women receive even less. This is due to chronic malnutrition in children. Up to 50% of girls are malnourished. The cycle is cyclical. As malnourished girls become malnourished adolescents who then marry early, have children early, have low birth weight babies who then become malnourished children and adolescents as well. Campbell concludes that due to SAPs, female malnutrition is not going away, with malnutrition falling to less than 1% a year for women. Fourth is economic opportunity. Detra and Perkson 15 find that privatization is an important element of structural reform efforts. However, because the state sector often employs women in greater numbers than other sectors of the economy, when privatization moves jobs from the public sector to the private sector, reduces women's employment and increases gender and economic discrimination. The male breadwinner bias refers to the fact that women are often passed over and encouraged to give up jobs to make way for men seeking employment. These expectations mean that as employment patterns shift in the wake of the IMF involvement, women's economic rights are more likely to be violated. This is empirically proven. Egypt's 1956 constitution included protections for several aspects of women's political and economic rights. Pre-IMF participation in the state sector and employment in the 1960s and 70s grew to 50% of women's formal employment. The trend reversed sharply when privatization and reductions in state spending led to fewer state sector jobs. Similarly, privatization from the IMF in Africa and Latin America in the 1990s has hurt women's employment prospects. After Zimbabwe instituted IMF-supported structural adjustment programs in 1990, the number of women working full-time dropped by 30,000. Fifth is funding cuts. As part of SAPs, the IMF mandates funding cuts. Campbellton continues that countries begin the budget cuts with social programs. The ramifications are felt especially by women. In Tanzania, 71 mothers died in the first 13 weeks of 1988 when economic reforms were enforced, 4 times the maternal death rate of any previous year due to healthcare cuts. Route 15 continues that this also hurts queer individuals. By privatizing healthcare, SAPs in sub-Saharan Africa open up the way for faith-based organizations to take control of healthcare. Faith-based organizations now make up 50% of social services in sub-Saharan Africa. Faith biases against the queer community perpetuated homophobic discourse and restricted access to social service. Underview, the judge must prioritize rejecting any instance of female oppression before evaluating any utility impacts. 2 warrants. First, you have an obligation to betray any instance of hegemonic masculinity and firm femininity. Scan Ewing 97 explained that supporting women's rights is not a part-time commitment. Individuals must act towards a feminist worldview in every possible setting. Anything we do without grounding ourselves in this mindset will be hopelessly contaminated. 2, judges to prioritize violence against marginalized groups because structural violence is underrepresented in conventional thinking. Nixon 11 finds that this is slow violence and occurs out of sight. This is typically not viewed as violence without. These sufferings are underrepresented, never receive solvency. Slow violence is exponential, operating as a threat multiplier, can fuel proliferating conflicts when the conditions for IMF life become degraded.
Okay, is everyone ready?
Oh, Zane, before you begin, can y'all send a doc?
On just a case script?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
My email's not letting. Oh, I don't have the case pulled up. The framing underview is written at the top, but we read it at the bottom.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, should be sent.
I'll let you know when I get it. Okay, I got it.
All right. Is everyone ready? All right. I'll start. We affirm contention one is creditworthiness. Brumo 8 explains less developed frontier economies seek to draw on the credibility of the IMF's institutional reputation for demanding tough policy conditions and a macroeconomic restraint as a way to signal to international audiences that they're a safe investment. The IMF has empirically increased sovereign credit ratings, as Lang 18 finds. Out of 177 statements from rating agencies that mention the IMF, 84 indicate a positive influence of an active IMF program on their assessment, while only one mentions a negative influence. Wiser 11 furthers that a 1% increase in FDI decreases poverty by 0.76% because of more investment into nation's companies growing growth. The World Bank 13 adds that FDI inflows had an employment effect of 26 million direct jobs and 42 million indirect jobs. Contention 2 is ethnic peace. Soisa 15 writes, IMF interventions in highly fractionalized societies make them safer. IMF involvement may empower large minorities to demand rights when a ruling group is in crisis and requires IMF assistance. Moreover, the IMF's oversight over state finances placates dominant ethnic groups who would otherwise be blamed for crises, and minority groups are likely to welcome a neutral actor for devising reforms because they would have better guarantees against being economically discriminated by the ethnic elite. Ethnic tension leads to violence. Ray 17. Government expenditures are often biased towards group-specific investments. Such policies create an enormous salience for claims that are ethnically based and generate ethnic violence. Violence kills. Handelman 2005. Since the middle of the 20th century, ethnic clashes have led to the death of 20 million people. The IMF helps. Socia quantifies that the IMF involvement could cut the level of ethnic tension in a country by half. Ghana proves. Key 14, Ghana is highly ethnically fractionalized, but avoided armed ethnic conflict when it began to implement IMF programs in the 1980s. Contention 3 is a currency crisis. Promoting exchange rate stability is one of the founding tenets of the IMF. In doing so, the IMF can prevent currency crises, which are massive devaluations of a country's currency due to a loss of an investment. The IMF prevents these in 3 ways. First is through reserves. The IMF requires all member countries to keep a minimum amount of currency in its banks when they join. Dreher 08 finds that a boost in reserve can help prevent crises, that the coffers are full will not only deter speculators from attacking the currency, but will reassure investors not to withdraw. This gives space to stabilize the economy, thus decreasing the risk of currency crises. Second is policy advice. University of Zurich 08. The IMF encourages countries to pursue economic policies geared towards creating an economy in which currency crises are unlikely. Markets see IMF programs as a seal of approval for the country's economic policies and choose not to attack the exchange rate. Third is by providing a scapegoat. Walter 08. Currency crises can be avoided when the IMF can function as a scapegoat where policymakers blame the IMF for forcing painful reforms. This enhances their ability to implement reforms despite public opposition. For these reasons, Dreher concludes, IMF involvement reduces the probability of a crisis. The IMF fulfills its functions of promoting exchange rate stability. Preventing currency crises is key to the stability of emerging markets. CFR 15. Emerging markets have an inherent weakness. Few investors are willing to stockpile their currencies. If cracks are detected, investors will dump the local currency. Currency crises cause debt defaults too. Hers and Carbo 5. The occurrence of a currency crisis significantly increases the risk of a contemporaneous debt crisis. When in a currency crisis, countries raise interest rates to stop capital outflows. Rising interest rates make the debt roll over and debt service more expensive and increases the incentive to default. Debt crises also spill over. CFR 15. The Asian financial crisis was triggered by Thailand's decision to flow its currency. Thailand's plummeting currency caused foreign investors to reassess other economies in the region, withdrawing their capital, sinking the region into financial crises. The impacts of a debt crisis are massive. Jones 16. Africa was hit by a cataclysmic debt crisis. The number of people living in extreme poverty increased by 125 million. Thus, we affirm.
Can we see a few cards?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Can I get Lang on C1? And then can I get the warranting on ethnic peace? I know you read Soisa, but whatever warranting you give for the empiric. And then can we just get whatever your impact off of ethnic peace was?
Zane, can you send those?
And what did you?
Yeah.
I think that's it. Yeah, and then we can take cross.
Taking prep?
Huh?
Are you taking prep?
No, we're just waiting for the
We
evidence.
can stay
and we can
unmuted.
do cross.
If not taking prep, could you stay unmuted? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You wanted to see the impact on the second contention, right?
Mhm.
All right. Ishan, can you send Lang? It's like not letting me control that.
Sure.
All right, I just sent everything else.
Don't you need a bestie?
All right, I sent Lang.
It's just a little. Okay, cool. You can start cross whenever you're ready. Whenever you're ready.
Oh yeah. You can have the first question.
Okay, sure. Why do developing countries have bad credit right now?
Because yeah, most people like don't want to lend with countries that they consider to have bad economies.
So that's why bad credit is bad. But I'm asking why do countries have bad credit right now?
Yeah, because they don't have opportunities to build up their credit because people don't like loan them money.
Well, they had good credit in like the 60s and the 70s, but what happened in the 80s and 90s that tanked the credit of the emerging markets?
There was a debt crisis.
Yeah, but who brought that debt crisis on?
I mean, we can argue that in like a speech. I feel like that's like the best place to have an argument about like the IMF, whether it had a dealing with the debt crisis. I don't like I can answer the question and say I don't think that the IMF caused the debt crisis, and you can say that it did cause the debt crisis.
I'm like not arguing with you. I'm just asking a question.
Oh, okay. My bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd say the debt crisis was. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead. Continue.
No, I would just say that the debt crisis was incurred by like all like other factors that weren't the IMF.
Sure. But after they took out debt from the IMF, those countries experienced postponements of the debt payments, which is why the international markets don't trust these countries and why they have bad credit scores. So if like an inability to pay back IMF loans is the reason countries have bad credit right now, at best, you're solving back an impact you created, but probably not even that, right?
Yeah, I'd say that at best, countries are building up their credit now, and at worst, even
They
if
have
they
been
didn't pay back those
building
debt, it was still a it was still a necessary bailout. So in like a world without the IMF, they would have just been screwed because no one would bail them
Not
out.
necessarily, because I'd say they're still screwed. But you can have a question.
Well, okay. Okay, let's talk about economic opportunities. So why is a private economy worse for women?
Because majority of women work in the public sector, and also the process of privatization like takes jobs away from those areas. Also, the other thing is that these countries, when they experience like an economic contraction, the male breadwinner bias, which is the IMF just like ignores as a reality, first of all, in their policy descriptions, means that women are expected to give up jobs or like opportunities for men. And so when there's a contraction of available services and resources, it inevitably hurts women, and it like reinforces those gender norms. Can I get a question?
All right. Yeah.
Okay, so on your ethnic peace argument, the internal link to this is that the economy gets better and like minority groups get more opportunities, right?
No, it's not the economy gets better. It's just that in a world with the IMF, and this was the SOISA, I still can't pronounce the SOISA evidence that like I sent. It's not that the economy doesn't need to get better. The economy, like income, doesn't need to improve. What does happen is that people like minority groups, ethnic minority groups, are more content with the IMF, someone that they see as neutral and not biased, dealing with their finances and their money than the ruling the majority group.
So
yeah.
Perceptual issue. All right, thanks.
Yeah, it's perceptual.
Okay, can you prep? All right, we're gonna just run prep. You can start our time now. Sorry, pausing prep is 50. Can I get the 26 million, 42 million evidence on the bottom of C1?
Zain, are you gonna?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I got it.
Okay.
All right, I sent it.
Okay. As soon as I get it, I'll like hold my phone to the screen and start prep.
All right.
Right, so I have that as 115. Is that okay with y'all? All right, Sanjita's computer like doesn't work properly, so she'll speak out of mine. All right, everybody good? Sounds good.
Starting the first argument about credit, the entire credit argument is flawed. It argues that A, having the IMF give more loans and give more debt to these countries is good because if they pay them back on time, they'll have better credit ratings so they can get future loans at cheaper rates. It assumes that B, these countries will even be able to pay back the debt in the first place. Name me one developing country apart from a part of the IMF that's been able to repay all of its IMF loans. We would say in the long term, taking out more and more loans just ruins their credit in the long term. But then second, Bond 20 says the reason credit ratings are even so low in the first place is because the G20 offered postponement of debt payments that caused international credit agencies to downgrade developing countries. And Bond 20 explains that despite IMF rhetoric, rating agencies still downgraded 79 countries, meaning the IMF hasn't changed the situation at all. But then specifically on their link about FDI, turn the argument, Gazille Law 15 gives two justifications for why FDI hurts developing countries. First, competition among the countries to attract FDI leads to reforms that reduce minimum wage and environmental standard conditions and working wages and leads to exploitation and taking advantage of host countries' low wages. And this, in the long term, FDI impairs living standards in host countries, especially for minority groups like women. But second, FDI often drives small local firms out of business, which results in high dependency on investor countries and volatility to external shocks, which means that developing countries are completely affected by price shocks in other countries and leads to recessions in the long term. This is also really, really bad, especially for minority groups who aren't able to recover from these long-term recessions. Go on to the second argument about ethnic conflict. First, the IMF causes civil conflict because Dreher 12 finds that it creates divisions within the government about whether or not to refuse conditionality, giving rise to dissent. This is why Hartzell 10 finds that IMF SAPs create winners and losers, altering the opportunity cost and prompting losers to engage in civil conflicts and ethnic conflicts. He concludes that the variable of a signed IMF SAP is a statistically significant predictor of civil conflict. Liberia is a proven example of this, and it's empirically true. Measures intended to balance the budget, such as national reconstruction taxes and higher excise taxes, targeted Liberian citizens, while multinational companies investing in the Liberian economy were granted a lot of privileges, and the adoption of the SAPs led to the outbreak of civil war in the country in 1989, which killed millions of people. You don't know if their conflict is actually going to stop. Just because their impact evidence says tensions go down doesn't necessarily mean that conflict goes down. If anything, we have a historical 100% probability example of solving for the conflict. But then people across the world literally hate the IMF. The BJP gets power from the IMF being bad. We would say, if anything, their link about how the IMF is like a good actor and people are going to gain some sort of confidence if the IMF is the actor makes zero sense, considering all developing nations think the IMF is pretty bad. But then Lena tells you the IMF required that Sierra Leone devalue its currency, and this currency devaluation also lowered the cost of Sierra Leone's minerals for other countries, incentivizing diamond extraction, and set the stage for civil unrest. Despite the settlement of the war, the nation faced a long road to recovery, and around 2 million Sierra Leoneans, almost half of the population of the small country, were displaced and thousands of them were killed. If anything, one, we have two historical examples of ethnic conflict getting worse, but B, you see that currency devaluation, which is their second, their third argument is really, really bad and causes civil conflicts. But go specifically onto their argument about currency. Shield 20 explains that adopting the yuan into the SCR basket or the special drawing rights basket means that the IMF is key to boosting the yuan's power contrary to the dollar, and the US has weakened from 102.5 index to 93.5 in the past year alone, which means the dollar is weakening. Simon 20 concludes that a weakening dollar is terrible for emerging markets because one, they rely on exports, and two, when the dollar weakens, it leads to capital outflow, which is a link into why devaluation is really, really bad. But then we would say that for countries undergoing debt relief, the IMF policy recommendations regularly include currency devaluations for two reasons. First, Beckington tells you it's to revitalize their exporting industry because before their undervalued imports in the territories that were really, really bad. So over time, in order to bring up those, the IMF tells these countries to devalue its currency. But second, they try to attract remittances into the country, especially this, it happened empirically in Sudan. And Dreher and Walter quantify that having an IMF program increases the likelihood of devaluation by 12 percentage points. Unfortunately, devaluation is really bad. Sharma tells you that the fall of the rupee in Pakistan reduced government spending, increased inflation, and is creating really bad joblessness and creating a recession in Pakistan.
Okay, can I see the last thing you read about the recession in Pakistan and just that currency devaluation bad?
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I just sent it off.
All right, I'll let you know when I get it, then I'll
No,
get on a call with Zane. Is it all 4 of these?
yeah, it's there's 4 cards in it.
Okay. I'll call him. All right. Okay, that was 150. The order is going to start with their framing argument. Our case, their case. Okay. Is anybody not ready? Okay. On their framing, if we prove any link into our benefits specifically impacting women, we also link in because you are still rejecting an instance of female oppression if we prove that the IMF is not good. They say you have an obligation to betray any instance of hegemonic masculinity, but everything is ingrained in masculinity to an extent. By that logic, you'd be rejecting every argument. If we prove the net benefits outweigh the harms of the IMF on women, then we should be able to win this round. Otherwise, it just infinitely skews us and we can't win the round. Yes, you should prioritize violence against marginalized communities, but we say that we link in better. I will get to that later. That said, let's go to our case. On our first contention, we'll concede the bond defense that kicks out of both the turns. Credit ratings are completely non-unique. On the second contention on ethnic conflict, the first thing they say is that you create winners and losers, which increases the likelihood of civil war. Burden 19 indicts the Hartzell evidence and finds that the IMF actually decreases the chance of civil war or has no effect on it, specifically because it reduces income inequality by increasing the amount of economic growth and freeing up government budgets. Prefer this. It's a direct analysis of their evidence and is more comparative and is more recent. They say they have an example, so prefer them. We also give you the example in our case from our case. So the example isn't a reason to prefer them. Then they say that developing countries don't like the IMF. It's not what politics about the developing countries are. It's about what the people within the developing countries care about, i.e. the ethnic minorities. If they see the IMF as a way to gain support and to promote what they believe in, then that is enough to convince governments to do the same. Then this is Sierra Leone. There was a civil war in Sierra Leone. First of all, Sierra Leone's diamond industry was very profitable. The blood diamonds that happened there likely could have occurred in either world. Moreover, Sierra Leone devalued their currency, yes, but the World Bank was also involved in this devaluation. It's not unique to the IMF. Plus, I'll get to why devaluing currencies is good on the currency crisis argument. This is the yuan is taking over. The US is a veto power over the IMF. It's never going to let the US dollar get significantly hurt because then it would completely undermine the US position in the entire world. They also don't contextualize how much you decrease exports or capital outflows. This isn't weighed. Then they said the IMF recommendations are like include devaluation. Yes, sometimes they do, but that's to stabilize the currency. Their Pakistan example doesn't specify the IMFs. Yes, the rupee could be devaluing right now, but that's for alternative causes. The IMF stabilizes the economies in the first place, and even if they do get devalued, we still increase stabilization per all three of the conceded warrants. The advice, policy, and reserves link all dropped. That's how. Let's go to their case. At the top, if we win ethnic conflict, we link in. The Soisa evidence directly says that the IMF empowers minority groups, all in general, to rise up and advocate for what they believe in. The comparatives that patriarchal structures exist in either world, even absent the IMF, other institutions, other Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the WTO, all and the governments themselves can be sexist. But the IMF itself is the only risk of solving back for the harms they create. Then, their first argument is about government. Government attention. Like even if the government, this argument isn't like it doesn't apply in the other world. Yes, the IMF can increase, might reduce the amount they spend on women in the short term, but that doesn't like get any better absent the IMF. The only risk is to increase spending that directly benefits women. I'll get to that as a turn on like one of their other links. Then they say policy focus. They don't prove to you how much the policies get focused specifically against women, and gender bias exists in either world, and so does policy focus. Moreover, we would argue that preventing things like currency crisis and defaults are the best way to avert these, because poverty is one of the most pervasive causes of violence against women in the developing world. It allows, for example, masculine people to use their wealth and leverage it against women, and the governments tend to cut, as per their link, against women first. So if we win any link of currency crisis, we also impact them, but we outweigh, because currency crises and debt crises impact the entire world, whereas they're constricted to where the IMF has their programs. Then they read you an argument of agriculture. You can turn it as Kogelman and Saxena writes that corrupt governments are willing to accept money from investors in exchange for land. However, the IMF solves back and decreases corruption via assistance and conditions which force transparency directly in the loans. Moreover, they said there's economic opportunity, but the IMF increases economic opportunity and net growth, and the Bird evidence says it reduces inequality, which is net good for women. Finally, on cuts, but Hand to 20, which is the most recent and best study on the issue, finds that the IMF uniquely increases social spending by 19%, which filters down to women because they're the ones that bear the brunt of lack of social spending right now.
Can you just send me the thing you read between corruption and the 19% turn?
What was that?
Whatever you read between corruption and 19% on our case.
Say, do you know what I read?
Yeah, it was like the IMF leads to like economic growth and reduces inequality.
Oh, okay.
Do you still want that then?
No, I just didn't catch it. Do you need it? 19%, you need it?
Okay.
Wait, the 19% is like the same study that like Gupta and like all them cite, right? Just that study. We'll just see it.
Sorry,
right?
what?
The 19% of it too.
Okay. No, I think it's more recent than Gupta. So, yeah.
Okay, then send that.
Yeah.
You can send it during cross too if you want to start.
It's fine. It'll take a second.
Anyways.
I sent it.
Oh, sorry. Can I also get the indent on Hartson that you read? Hartle. When you're frontlining your C2 and ethnic piece.
The Bird evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. I sent it. Let me know when you get it.
Yeah, I'll hold my phone up to the screen. We'll run prep before cross. That was 15 seconds, so 1:30 left.
Okay, I'm good for this. Okay. I guess. Okay, I guess let's talk about your currency crisis argument. So right now, what currencies are being used as the reserve currencies for special drawing rights in the IMF?
Seems like, you know.
Yeah, it's like the dollar, the yuan was recently created into a reserve currency for the SDRs. And like, I'd say that's pretty damning, right? Like if the yuan is now a reserve currency and everyone is able to use it through the SDRs, that basically hyper increases the value of the yuan, offsetting the dollar. So if that's true, if
I wouldn't say it offsets the dollar. I think that's an
yeah.
assumption.
So our argument is that if it offsets the dollar, it leads to massive capital outflow out of developing nations back into the United States. This is exactly what made the COVID crisis so bad in the first place for developing nations, because at the start they were pretty insulated from the COVID crisis. But once there was capital fly out of the countries because of the devaluation of the dollar, that's what led to economic crisis in those countries. So you can get a question.
Was that a question?
No, I'm done. You can have a question. I was just going on.
Okay. All right. I guess we can talk about your like framing argument. So how do you want us to engage with it?
You can like
Link in or
respond to the
respond.
framing or link into it. I don't know how
Okay.
else.
So do Lincoln's work?
I don't
Yours
think your Lincoln's work, but you could read Lincoln's.
Okay.
All right. Can I get a question?
Yeah, that's fine. You can have a question.
I guess. Okay, let's just talk about like civil conflict as a whole. So let's talk about an example of like civil rights, or like, for example, in the civil rights movement that happened in the United States, you know, there was like racial groups that were fighting each other, for example. In that conflict, were Black women, did they gain the same rights that Black men gained during the civil rights movement?
I would assume not, but I think that's a little bit different from like what's happening now, and like
yeah, I agree it's somewhat different, but
Yeah.
I'm just trying to use an example of some sort of civil unrest between two groups. In the past, when there has been civil rights movements or resolution of this kind of like between two ethnic groups or two races, has there been equal or like has there been intersectional increases of rights for women in these movements?
There probably have been increases in rights for women, like whether maybe they're not at like the exact same rate, yes,
Yeah,
but the argument we would make is that is a lot better than what would have elsewise occurred.
No,
Maybe
because
they're not
I
the same
would say
rate, but the rate at which it occurs, like maybe if the proportion is a lot higher, like to the benefit.
No, I'd say that rhetoric is exactly what perpetuates this. Like, sure, even if you're going to solve economic harm, you're going to solve civil conflict or whatever, I think that those conflicts will always exist. Economic decline will always exist. But a prerequisite to making sure that this happens on an equitable scale is creating an economic framework that prioritizes women first. And without that framework, you can't solve civil conflicts in a fair way. You can't solve economic crisis in a fair way. But that's correct.
Okay.
We have a minute 30, so we're just gonna run prep. You can start. Okay. The order will be my case, their case, but I'll start at the bottom on the underview. Can I get a thumbs up when everyone's good? Okay.
Oh, sorry, I need a second.
Okay, for sure. Let me lower my chair anyways.
Okay, you're good. Thank you.
Okay. On the underview, they try to link in, I'll get to that later, but the next thing it says that everything is always going to be ingrained in some kind of oppression and rejecting one instance if it doesn't solve. That's a terrible mindset. The Shad and Ewing evidence literally feeds into what they're saying, which is that you have to be a feminist in every single scenario, in every instance. Without doing that, you can never solve or create any sort of meaningful policy change. That means that you have to reject it anytime you see an instance of female oppression. If we prove that the IMF is a patriarchal structure, you as a judge have an obligation to reject in this round. They also dropped the Nixon 11 evidence, which finds that violence against women is slow violence, unseen, it's not represented in things like conventional thinkings, whereas things like war and ethnic conflict are, which they another unique reason to prefer prioritizing women's rights over any other impacting states. Round that goes dropped is clean to vote for us. Let's go to their Lincoln. 2 reasons why they don't Lincoln. First, war and econ and all these different things are always going to be inevitable. You should prioritize the team that best solves for it and the residuals and rebuilding. At that point, when there's international institutions like the IMF that are fundamentally patriarchal, you'll always rebuild on a patriarchal structure, which means that it's inevitably always going to create oppression against females. But then second, we have scope. It's all women in every single country everywhere. They don't really give you a contextualized scenario. And finally, the fact that they don't read a single card about how ethnic conflicts hurt women is already feeding into our case. When you have the mindset that when you solve overarching issues like economic harms or ethnic conflict without actually hyper-analyzing for the impact that it has on women, it feeds into the blanket solution, which doesn't cause any issue. Go to the case at the top. At the top, the SOSA evidence says they link it to minorities. You can read it from the bottom. Then they say that there are other instances of the patriarchy. That's not a reason to not reject the IMF. You should just reject the IMF, the World Bank. Everything is patriarchal. Reject all of it. I don't mind. On our second warrant about the policy focus, they misunderstand it. They say that poverty causes violence and a bunch of other things. Again, that's not our argument. Our argument is that the IMF fundamentally evaluates countries based on the productive economy versus the reproductive economy, which is why in India, even though the IMF program created an overall growth net rate, it ignores the fact that most women face massive economic opportunity loss. That's the same thing that they say when they say that they link it to things like poverty or solving ethnic conflict. It feeds into our mindsets a reason to reject them. Then on agriculture, David A. Turner about how corruption solves and how the IMF increases economic growth. You can group both of these with the productive economy. I say over, but second, they never would have opened up the economies for foreign landholders to take advantage of corruption if they hadn't liberalized in the first case. Our case is still a fundamental prerequisite. At that point, you can extend the agricultural link across the flow as well, which is that when you open the economy up to cash crops, it creates malnourished cycles of malnourishment, which hurts women adversely. That's 2 independent reasons why you should prioritize our side. Go to their case. On ethnic peace, they say that they do give an example. They don't. The only example of ethnic peace that they give is this example of Ghana. Look to our case where you tell the Ghanaian women have literally been screwed for decades because while you saw back for ethnic things like peace, you don't saw back for the economic inequalities, which like Ghanaian women have the highest rates of malnutrition anywhere in the world. They also mishandled the Sierra Leone Lincoln, which we tell you is that the IMF fueled a war over the diamond resources. They say that the diamond resources would have always had value and it's not unique to the IMF. That's not true because the IMF is the one that liberalized their economies and opened up. Other institutions didn't do that. That's a unique link into 2 million lives that have been lost to ethnic conflict in the region. They don't win its impact. But what they really lose around is on the SDR argument. All they say is the US will never let this hurt them. It already has. The yuan has already been added to the SDR to be a stronger reserve currency, which means that the dollar's gone down 10 points in the last year. This is really bad for the emerging markets that they talk about because it screws their export base. And second, it also means that it is a foreign outflow of currency.
All right, we'll take prep.
Yeah.
I had that as y'all's prep.
It's over now.
All right. All right. It's going to start off on the framing and then go to their case, then our case. Is everyone ready? All right. Let's start off on their framing. They say that we have a terrible mindset because we have to be a feminist in every single scenario. We 100% agree with it, and we just want to make it clear that we're not disagreeing that we need to be a feminist in every single scenario. But what we argue is that patriarchy exists in either world. So instead of saying we should reject the patriarchy, we should instead specifically focus on rejecting the ways in which the patriarchy manifests itself, right? Instead of just saying the patriarchy is bad, we should just say the patriarchy is apparent in this way, and solving this through that is a good thing in rejecting the actual impacts of the patriarchy. Then they say that the war and the economy are inevitable. Yeah, so are a lot of issues, but that doesn't mean that just because a war will exist eventually doesn't mean that we should push war down the line. And just because an economic crash will eventually happen doesn't mean that we shouldn't build a stable economy. Let's go on to their case. At the top, we tell you that the other institutions will always be patriarchal. They say that we should just reject all of it. Sure, we should reject the patriarchal institutions as a whole, even if the IMF is patriarchal, insofar as it's the only one that has any way of helping women. Yes, even if they're patriarchal, they're still the only ones that can actually have a tangible impact on women, insofar as all of the harms that they talk about happen in either world through other institutions. The IMF is the only way to cause the economic growth and reduce tensions that disproportionately affect women. Let's talk about their argument. Let's talk about their argument about funding cuts. They can see that with the IMF, there's a 19% increase in social spending, which specifically helps women as per their own link because of things like increased healthcare, which is pretty clear offense for us. With that being said, let's talk about our case and then I'll weigh after. The first reason to vote for us is on our argument about ethnic conflict. Our argument is very simple. We tell you that ethnic minorities prefer the IMF dealing with their finances over the majority that is oppressing them. That is very important. That's why the IMF has decreased ethnic tensions in countries by 1/2, which is very important because ethnic tensions have left to 20 million dead. Their main responses in summary are twofold. First, they say that Ghana has been screwed for decades and they're extremely malnutrition. Sure, there exist problems within Ghana, but I'd argue that without the IMF, these problems would have manifested themselves into war, which would disproportionately affect women because, as they said themselves, in times of civil distress, women are pushed aside. So when there's civil gains, sure, maybe women aren't getting as much of a benefit as women, but when there are civil losses, women are getting a hell of a lot more hurt than men are, meaning that we should try to reject civil losses and prevent them from happening. This is Sierra Leone incurred civil conflict because of the IMF, but remember what Ishan tells you, that Sierra Leone is their diamonds were very profitable. Most likely the extortion of their diamonds would have happened in either world. On our argument about currency crisis, we tell you, we'll go through our argument about reserves. We tell you the IMF mandates that countries keep a reserve, which they can pull out of when they're having a currency issue. They tell you that the yuan is becoming more it's becoming bigger than the US dollar, and the US dollar is tanking, hurting developing countries. I'd argue they say this already has occurred, but that's not true. The US dollar has not become less valuable than the yuan. That isn't true. And our argument is very simple, that in times of poor currency, it leads to debt defaults, which we've seen historically push 250 million people into poverty. The important distinction here is that in their world, sure, economic harms happen to women, but in times of debt crisis, those economic harms get a lot worse to women, as they say themselves, because in times of economic crisis, women are pushed aside while men are basically just given a free pass.
You can have the first question.
Do you have one, Zane?
Ishan. No, do you have one?
All right, y'all want to take one?
Okay. Can you give me an example of a country that's benefited from lower levels of ethnic conflict this time?
What? Sorry.
Lower ethnic conflict?
Mm-hmm.
Every country would benefit from lower ethnic conflict.
No, because of the IMF.
We give you the example of.
It's the only example. The only example you give.
There's probably more out there, but we don't need to focus on all examples.
No, I think we do. Let's talk about Ghana. So Ghana's the only example that you can give. What we tell you is that even though the IMF has prevented things like war or whatever in Ghana, if that's true, I don't really know, Ghanaian women still face the highest levels of malnutrition because the IMF opened up the agricultural sectors and cash crops flooded the area, creating food crisis. What this means is that everything I said in my summary that you all just don't respond to about how solving overarching conflicts like war, econ, and saying that also solves back for women is just false. Because unless you have the mindset that you're specifically prioritizing women while you're solving for these things, you never will.
Why are we not?
Sure.
Why are we not prioritizing women in this case?
You're not, because you're saying that the way that you're linking into the women argument is you're saying when we benefit the economy, when we prevent war, that also helps women. My argument is that when you have that mindset, it feeds into the same thing the IMF does, where they're like, oh, we increase the overall growth rate of India, women are benefiting from that. But if you actually look at the numbers, women face higher rates of poverty, higher rates of malnourishment, and higher rates of unemployment than they did before, which is why arguments overarching are flawed. And that's also true in Ghana,
Yeah,
which is the example that you state.
Yeah, I feel like it's unfair to like say that us and the IMF have the same mindset. I'm not an IMF like spokesperson, but I'm pretty sure their mindset is that they just like they don't try to justify the effects of like the women in their economies because they don't really care, right?
No, I mean,
That's their issue, right? I think they're two separate issues, right? I don't think we're doing this like it's like the same
problem against you. Like, I don't know, like
No, I know. I would hope so, but
yeah, like
no.
I'm sure you're not sexist, but when you say things like when we increase economic growth, when we solve war, this also helps women, and that's an equal way to link in as argument. You do have their mindset, which is my problem.
Sure, your evidence is definitely like that's not an issue. Like we're not contesting that our evidence is like more specific to women than yours. You guys prepped this like very well. No, I understand. If I may finish, all our argument is that sure, we agree that women in IMF countries and in countries around the world are universally at worse positions than their male counterparts. What we argue is that in an alternate world, what we argue is even if it's because of the IMF, in an alternate world where the IMF doesn't exist, if there's large ethnic conflicts, our argument is that we would have seen a worse world for women today. That's our argument.
No,
it at least would have been an equitable foundation that you could then solve
like
that.
I guess my
I'll say this.
These are ethnic issues. I feel like even if women were at the same place as men,
that's like well over. It's like well over.
All right.
I think we have 45 seconds of prep. Is that fine with you?
30? I think you took 15.
Okay, cool. We'll run prep.
Okay, start on our case with the framing and then their case. Zane starts us the summary by saying that the patriarchy exists in both worlds and we should reject how the patriarchy manifests itself. We say the way the patriarchy manifests itself is through international organizations like the IMF. Sure, if other organizations like the World Bank are also sexist, we would say, sure, you can reject them too. The resolution is only about the IMF. This is not a policy resolution. There's no our world or their world. You can reject all of the international organizations for all I don't care, but this is specifically about the IMF. Then they try to link it through war, but they drop the Nixon evidence, which says that gendered violence is a form of slow violence, which means that there's a conflict magnifier and over time the impacts manifest longer and longer, whereas war is not a form of slow violence, which means they have no linking to our argument. But then they try to say something about how solving for war and overall economic growth is going to solve for women. That literally feeds into our link about policy focus. When you try to say that overall solving for war and solving for economic growth is going to solve for the impacts of women, we see that's empirically not true. If anything, they actually have gotten worse for women. When you try to adopt the overarching view, you never actually solve for the underlying issues of women, and that's what our framing contests. Then they try to, we say that conflict is always inevitable, economic decline is always inevitable. The first thing you need to do is you need to adopt a framework where women are prioritized before you can solve for the residuals of these inevitable impacts. That gets dropped, but then extend our link about policy focus. We say that the IMF ignores the reproductive economy where most women work and what's needed for sustainable life. They work 70% of the sector, but only receive 1% of the wealth. When they ignore the productive sector, the reproductive sector of the economy, women are disproportionately harmed. Their 19% social spending argument links into this. Sanjay tells you that this links into the productive economy because they're increasing overall spending, but they don't actually help women. On their case, on Sierra Leone, they say that we don't give a reason as to why the IMF caused it. They never would have gained access to the diamonds in Sierra Leone if the IMF hadn't liberalized. They flow through ink. We have 2 million lives lost there. You don't know if their ethnic conflict scenarios actually going to manifest where we tell you that it already happened. They give one example of Ghana that links into our case because Ghanaian women are literally screwed right now, even if they solve for the conflict. On the currency, they say that we have no empirics. No, in the past 2 years, the US dollar has fallen 10 points, which is literally screwed developing nations during the COVID crisis because of massive capital outflow. We have 2 links on their case, and they're also just losing the framing.
Okay, and I'll be their case, like the framing stuff, but then I'll signpost from there. Okay. in their last speech, they don't extend why you should prioritize slow violence over other forms of violence. If we link via economic growth, Zane gives you the warranting that is a manifestation of the patriarchy. If we isolate our impacts off of women, we are accessing their argument. They say that it is inevitable. Just because it's inevitable doesn't mean it shouldn't be prioritized. They don't read you why it being inevitable in the first place means you shouldn't prioritize it. Moreover, they say you solve for the residuals, but if we beat them to the residuals, then we win the link because we explain to you and we give weighing and comparative arguments as to why women are disproportionately affected by things like debt crises and disproportionately helped by things like social spending. More specifically, they say that you can reject other institutions outside of the IMF, but this is still a resolutional debate. They haven't told you that you do anything outside of it. Yes, you are still linking it back to the IMF and how we control the patriarchy, but other institutions also increase senses of the patriarchy. If we prove that the IMF is the best way of solving back for it, or the only risk of solving back for it, their argument only exists within a vacuum. You cannot achieve progress when you exist arguments within a vacuum. If we prove that other institutions like the World Bank, who always have incentives to hurt women, and the IMF is the only way you can actually have a risk of helping them, it is comparatively better. Yes, the IMF is not perfect, and but that doesn't mean you're necessarily rejecting an instance of patriarchy by not voting for it. If we prove that you're rejecting other instances of patriarchy by voting for the IMF, i.e., other systems are like comparatively worse, then we win the argument there. Then on the social spending turn, it's not interacted with until the final focus. We explained that the IMF increases social spending by 19%. They say this just links back into the reproductive sector, but there's no warrant as to why it does. We say that women bear the brunt of the lack of social sector, lack of social safety nets absent the IMF. So an increase in it helps women a lot more than it would help men. That said, let's go to our case. On Sierra Leone, they don't extend a link on Sierra Leone. They just say it killed 2 million people, and they don't. And moreover, realize our argument on ethnic conflict is generalized, so we affect a lot more crises than just that one. And plus, the World Bank could have done the same thing and was going to do the same thing on currency crisis. Remember our argument, which is that the IMF makes countries hold off reserves to avert currency crisis, and when their currency devaluated, they're able to sustain them, which is keeping 250 million people from going into poverty. Their turn doesn't actually respond to ours because it's not happening right now. We still have reserves to stop back for the currency crises. So we link by the economic distress.
Good job, y'all.
Good job.
Good round, y'all.
Yeah, good round.
Great. Anyone not here ready for the RFD? Sure hope Strake is not gone.
Yeah, we're here.
Great. Thought it was an all right round. I voted for the con side for Dougherty. I think there's plenty of places that I could look to vote for them. So I'm going to talk about maybe four. One, I think the policy bias argument that Nick gives outframes all of the AF's attempts to link in, because they just fall into the question of how does this generalized impact affect women, which, I mean, they are half the population, so sure, it does to some degree, but not in the specified way the AF says, or the neg says you must be to link in directly. And their argument claiming that broad economic policy fails to take into account these underlying issues is one that never goes contested, which means I don't buy any question that the AF has of, isn't there something good that happened through the IMF? Because if that's true, those ways that you assess its goodness is done in a gendered manner, which I think the NAF never really contests, which means that I vote on it. I also think that the AF is never contesting the idea that we ought to prioritize women until the final focus, and their method of contesting that in the final focus was saying the warrant for it wasn't extended, but it is. So I can also vote on that framework, given that this is a strong link into that framework, and therefore that's enough for me to vote from the next side. Other places I can vote. So second, I think the characterization of gendered violence we get with the Nixon evidence from the neg side also beats all the AF's attempts to link into the debate, because given that it's residual violence that flies under the radar and therefore primes us for these broader scale impacts, it's already a better way to access what the AF gets, because it's contingent on proving that we're primed for those sorts of major issues. And also, I think that their characterization that these are ones that don't go addressed compared to the broad policy focus we have on the bigger scale issues means that the attempts that the AF gives to link into underlying issue framing by saying we do so by stopping these major issues are ones that don't necessarily have to go addressed via this policy or via this actor. And therefore, I would prioritize ones that are more residual, more subtle, more under the radar, and therefore, still go towards the only links in the round that are in that manner, which is the negs. So the AF saying that we stop this through these major impacts also bites into the next characterization that only ones that are unseen by society are ones that we should prioritize. And that impact comparison is also not responded to until the final focus claims that the warrant for it wasn't extended. Third, I think the AF's social spending turn is not a place I can vote. It is overtime in rebuttal and then not warranted in summary. Just here, extend that 90% increase in social spending that gets better healthcare. And then the final focus is the first time I hear this ever implicated to the idea of how this impacts women directly, which I think is already biting into the framing that the neg gives about why we can't generally say there's good economic things, and then that suddenly gets towards better lives for women. And I also think that them saying that they bear the brunt of the social sector might have been similar to things that the neg was saying in their case, but it's certainly not enough warranting that I need to turn this into a voting issue for the neg side, for the AF side. And therefore, I don't really think this is a place I can vote. Comparatively, I do think that the lives of women are made better off when we have a focus on their parts of the economy, which I think they already explained is a part that the IMF restricts or obscures or does not focus on, which already beats back any AF attempt to link and do that. And then fourth, I think if I had to evaluate, give the AF a huge degree of leeway on a lot of the issues of the debate, I would presume that we let them link into the framing, that this is the best way to do it, that we look at the economic issues. So I'm going to skip the fact that the AF didn't explain how it is that this link in directly affects women, and skip the fact that the AF didn't explain why their link into women is more significant than the negs, i.e. why their method of linking it is better, because you can't just say we affect women, you have to prove why your effect is greater. But let's say that economic crisis was the one, and that's the one that they do extend in their final focus, this contention 3. I don't think they're being the turn that the neg gives about how currency is or comparatively made worse off, which weakens the power of the dollar compared to the yuan, which is added to the currency basket from the IMF. And that's caused developing nations to lose power for that dollar and lose power of their exports and such, which is hurting them during this COVID crisis. The AF does not respond to this except saying it's not happening, which I think the neg has said that it is. They give empirics about the dollar being down 10 points. So this is also a place I would vote. I don't really hear a good extension from the AF side for how it is they connect this towards impacts, which I think is weaker than the neg's explanation. So I think at best, or at worst for the neg, I would probably be voting for them. At worst, this would just be a wash for both sides, given that there isn't a lot of comparison for why is one side's argument on the currency crisis argument is better than the other, i.e. why one side has a better link into economic issues than the other. But I could also just end up voting neg here as a way of getting them offense on the last place that the AF could possibly have to vote for them on. So I also don't think there's a lot of places that I could vote AF. The ethnic conflict thing is not extended, but if I really had to evaluate it, I probably would have voted on this Sierra Leone thing, but I don't really have to look at that because it is not in the AF's final focus. So I don't think there's any places I could look at where I see the AF winning an issue. I think the AF's arguments have all been largely framed out of the round since the rebuttal speeches. And then the rest of the round is just kind of extending those things and the AF not really beating back what the next characterizations are. Any specific questions, things we want to talk about? Parts that needed more clarification?
We're good. We're good.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.
Great. Goodbye.